Hello and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are going to talk about orchids and my personal recommendation for quote unquote the beginner Paphiopedilums. And just to start that off, I'm not going to necessarily recommend a certain species or hybrid, but I'm going to recommend I'm going to recommend types of Paphiopedilums by the color of their leaves. Now, most people or most growers separate Paphiopedilums into mottled leaves with the patterning versus green leaves with the solid green color. But I go solely by the color since some of the green leaf Paphiopedilums may be mottled, and I'll show you what I mean by that. And just to break these two dark and light leaves down, the darker leaves will require less light, and the lighter leaves, the lighter green leaves, will require more light. Jumping into our first topic, that will be the darker leaves. Now, the darker leaf Paphiopedilums do tend to be the mottled ones, but again, I will show you where that contradicts itself. But the ones I will show you, for the most part, the darker colored will have the mottling as well as the purple undersides. Now, the reason why, I don't know if it's the reason, but the function of these darker leaves with the purple undersides is because these plants use these adaptations to absorb more light. The darker leaves do not require a lot of light to photosynthesize, and the purple reddish bottoms of the leaves help the light to reflect back into the top of the leaf. So basically, as the light shines through the leaf, it'll hit the bottom red purple portion and reflect back upward into the leaf. And it's a pretty interesting technique, and something actually I had learned from studying the Maranta plant. I do have a red Maranta, which does have red on the undersides as well as some of the veining, but primarily on the underside of the leaf. And this is why the darker Paphiopedilums are considered lower light, and why I also have them on the lower shelves and even on the floor of my grow space. Now, watering for these Paphiopedilums, in my experience, because they tend to be a bit more on the terrestrial side when it comes to the parentage or even the species, they tend to enjoy being a bit more wet. And I think it's because they're mainly found on like the forest floors and in shrubbery and rocks and cliffs, and in their natural habitat, they're found in moist areas for the roots. So don't allow them to go bone dry, but do not keep them wet, and water them as they approach dryness. Now, jumping on to temperature for our darker colored darker colored Paphs, the temperature will depend on the species, and of course will depend on, the environment that you have it in, as most Paphiopedilums will be able to survive in our homes and in the greenhouse environment. And in my experience, I've learned that thicker leaves tend to hold more water, so they can withstand the extremes of a bit more colder or hotter periods. Not too long, but these situations again may require a rest or decrease watering situation in the cooler times, and when it's warmer, they just may require more water and basically no rest time. But again, the temperature really depends on the species and not really if you have a darker or a lighter leaf. Now, just like temperature, the humidity doesn't really play too much of a role, but I will say something about all Paphs is that they have this stomata that stays open 24 hours. So all plants have a stomata, which is like their respiratory organ, which are known to open at night. But on Paphiopedilums, they are actually open 24/7. And the stomata are basically responsible for the exchange of water and carbon dioxide between the plant and the surrounding air. So basically, again, like I mentioned before, it's its respiratory organ. And for Paphs, because this is open 24 hours, humidity only helps them. For the most part, most Paphs do have a thinner leaf structure, especially in comparison to Phalaenopsis and other orchids. So humidity and anything that will help retain the water without keeping the medium wet is going to be beneficial for the orchid. So now that we've touched on the darker leaves, let's go on to the lighter leaf Paphiopedilums, and the ones that people tend to think are not mottled. But as you can see in some of the stills that I show, a lot of the lighter Paphiopedilums are mottled, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they need a super bright light, but giving them more light, especially with regard to duration. I like to keep my entire grow space under a minimum of 12 hours. So during my winter season, they never go below 12 hours, but during the summer, I do bump it up to 14 and sometimes to 16 hours if my wintertime is going to be prolonged. I did try about 15 and a half hours when I was in DC, but I was a little just taken back, and I didn't really like to do that because my summer ended when it ended. But here, the summertime kind of goes all the way up into September, almost October, so we'll see about the light. Now, getting on to the lighter colored leaves, they in turn will require more light. They can take more light, so you actually should give them more light. One of the examples of the brighter colored leaves is the Rothschildianum, and I don't own the species, but I do have it in a lot of hybrids in my collection. And in the wild, this species can actually be found in full sun, like completely yellow leaves in full sun, and still be a healthy plant. So this is why I opt to give light or put closer to the light any of my Paphs that have lighter green leaves or plain green leaves, because I know that they can take it. Now, I know people will think, oh, if you put your plant close to the light, it can suffer sunburn, but really, sunburn has to do with the heat that the light gives off, and because I grow under LEDs, and most of us grow under LEDs, actually putting them closer to the light source is not really going to affect them in a negative way. I don't put them, super close to the light. I do have two or three plants or orchids that are extremely close to the light that I'm testing out, and they're completely fine. One is actually in spike. One of my phals is in spike. And the other one is also a phal. So light is only beneficial. And with regard to watering, they're very similar to the darker leaf Paphs. They don't really change. However, you should get to know your species, because I do have, for example, a Paph, the Pharianum, which comes from a very higher mountain elevation and can withstand being dry. However, my Delenatii, which is a darker mottled leaf Paphiopedilum, can also go dry. So it really just depends on your species. And I do mean bone dry. And this is all indicative of temperature. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where your environment can harbor a temperature below 55 degrees, these Paphiopedilums, such as the Pharianum, which is all green, or the Delenatii, which is mottled, these Paphs will require a rest where they don't require any type of water. You can spritz the medium to make sure that it's a bit moist, but the medium can absolutely be dry for some time if the temperatures are low. And I'm not going to spend too much time on temperature and humidity, since I talked about them with the green leaf with the green leaf Paphiopedilums, and basically the care is the same. So some pointers that I'll leave you with is that the flowers on your Paphiopedilums, whether they're green, light green, or dark green will last long. They're typically long-lasting flowers. However, if you can keep your humidity above 50% or more, the longevity of the flower will drastically change and increase. Also, because paphs are very sensitive to water quality, having good water quality will typically be very good, because the roots on paphs do not necessarily grow back in normal circumstances, and they don't normally branch like our phals do. Next is, when you're repotting your Paphiopedilum, make sure you center it at the center of the pot. I know a lot of people think that you're supposed to put the back growth nearest the edges of the pot, but the back growth can actually put out a new growth. It can grow anywhere, basically. So you definitely want to center your paph whenever you're repotting. And lastly, make sure that you pot it low, and preferably in small bark or moss if you're gonna live on the wild side. I do grow in a dry environment, so normally my humidity is below 50% without the humidifiers. So I do use moss in my mix, just about maybe 30 to 40%, very close to half, but not necessarily unless it's my phals. And I'll leave you all with those few pointers. Thank you again for staying tuned to this video. Follow me on social media. My Instagram and Facebook names are The Right Paph, like here on YouTube. And we'll see you in the next video.